Welcome again on behalf of UNDP to this webinar. This is our second webinar. Ramadan Kareem to all of those celebrating this holy month. My name is Naja Hashimi. I'm the Electoral Policy Specialist with UNDP in our regional office for the Middle East and North Africa, based in Amman. I'm your moderator for this webinar on impact of COVID-19 on elections. By now, we all know the serious consequences of the pandemic on our health and safety, on the economy, and especially on our social lives. But we don't quite know yet the full impact of COVID-19 on political life. Since its outbreak, the pandemic has threatened scheduled elections and democratic processes around the world and has created unprecedented challenges for countries planning elections this year, including countries at critical junctures in their transition to electoral democracy. As the pandemic extends beyond a month, 2 months, 3 months, its implications on elections, on the electoral cycle, and on our fundamental right to vote and take part in elections are significant and growing. Governments are faced with difficult decisions that on the one side can risk accelerating the spread of the virus if elections are held as planned, or creating potential crises of legitimacy if they are postponed. Thus far, more than 50 countries have postponed elections due to the pandemic, and 19 countries have gone ahead with elections as originally scheduled. What are the implications of these decisions on political participation and voter turnout? Intuitively, we would understand that there would be low voter turnout in elections held during such a global pandemic because of fear of catching the virus, because of the stay-at-home measures, because of the lack of infrastructure in many of our countries to ensure public health and safety. Political campaigns may not be as effective in the midst of social distancing measures, and that has a direct impact on turnout. Voter turnout is feared to be lower, particularly among elderly voters and those with underlying medical conditions. But what is actually happening on the ground when elections decisions are being made? Are people reluctant to vote? Does the pandemic disenfranchise the already disadvantaged? How does it affect voter behavior? If campaigns are moving online, does this create new opportunities for younger, more tech-savvy candidates, parties? How does the gender digital divide measure into the equation? Are electoral authorities influenced by these questions? We hope these issues will be enlightened by the discussion that our panelists will have for you today. We have a high-level panel of speakers, and we hope that their presentation, as well as the conversation we will have with one another through the chat, will shed some light on these issues. We understand how participation and voter turnout considerations factored into the very different decisions taken by Tunisia and the US state of Wisconsin. We will also get a snapshot of turnout and participation in elections globally and zoom into the recent experience of South Korea and how the commission there managed to hold credible elections during a pandemic and with record turnout. We know the context in each country is different. Some are seeing the flattening of the curve, while others have yet to reach the peak of the virus. In these presentations, we'll see how these differences, as well as variations in socioeconomic and political contexts, all played a role in how EMBs responded to elections during the pandemic. We as UNDP hope you will find these discussions useful. We are happy to see so many of you here from so many parts of the world. It's clear that these issues are of great concern to all of us. We know that the more we share and learn, the better prepared we will be as an election community to not only operate within the new normal, but to build back better. This is our second webinar, and we plan to bring these to you every 2 weeks. We are testing out the translation services offered through Zoom in 3 languages this time, English, Arabic, Spanish, but we do hope to bring you in additional languages in the future. During this discussion, we encourage you to interact with the panel and with each other via the chat box by sharing your comments, questions, and suggestions. This is the best way we can do this in difficult times, so let's make the most of it. Before I begin, just to let you know, you have the agenda there. We have 10 minutes for each speaker. We'll go into a Q&A, As you will see, for those of you who were here the last time, we changed the format a bit by reducing the number of speakers to 3 and increasing the Q&A session. This was a request of all of you to have more time to discuss and ask questions of the speakers. Please feel free to write your questions, comments throughout the session, but we'll get to them during the Q&A. And you're free to write your name and organization if you like in the chat box. The link to this webinar will be available for those of you who want to share it later with your colleagues and for those that were not able to attend. Again, to those people who joined us today, the webinar is in 3 languages. I will once again ask Osama and Nicholas to give a quick instruction to the colleagues who have joined since they introduced the interpretation. So Osama and Nicholas, can you again tell us how to connect in the different languages?
شكرا ناجية. رامي, thank you ناجية. مرة ثانية للأشخاص اللي دخلوا حاليا للويبينار، كنا بنلاحظ إنه في تقريبا 50 شخص دخلوا، فبشكل سريع حتى تفعلوا الترجمة، لأنه مثل ما ذكرت ناجية في ترجمة من اللغة العربية والإسبانية. لتفعيلها حاليا راح يطلع عندكم. طيب لتفعيل اللغة العربية مرة ثانية للأشخاص اللي انضموا لنا حاليا، مثل ما حكينا إنه الزوم مش ضايف اللغة العربية كلغة تحت زوم، نحاول نتواصل مع زوم ليضيفوها كلغة، لكن بنفس اللحظة إحنا بنستخدم القناة اليابانية لنقدم الترجمة العربية من خلالها. فلهيك عندكم على برنامج زوم رح تلاقوا تحت في إشارة هيني بأشر فيها بالماوس اسمها interpretation، تشبه الكرة الأرضية، تكبسوا عليها بتطلع عندكم هاي القائمة اللي تحت اللي فيها off English Japanese Spanish. اختاروا الجابانيز أو الياباني لسماع اللغة العربية. بتحتاجوا أيضاً لسماع اللغة العربية فقط وعدم سماع الصوت الأصلي من المتحدث الضغط أيضاً على mute original audio. إذا تم الضغط عليها رح تكونوا قادرين على سماع المتحدث أو المترجم فقط، فإحنا بنفضل إنه تكبسوا عليها حتى تكونوا قادرين على سماع الترجمة فقط هون. وبتوقع هون أنا خلصت. Over to you, Nicholas. Spanish.
Thank you very much, Osama. Buenos días a todos los hispanohablantes dentro de la transmisión. Es un placer realmente tenerlos a todos el día de hoy. Muy simple. El software nos permite tener interpretación simultánea. En ese sentido, estas son las siguientes instrucciones para que ustedes puedan acceder a ellos. En la parte del panel de control, que se ubica generalmente en la parte inferior de sus pantallas, tienen una opción bajo el título de interpretación, que, bueno, es esta... Viene caracterizado por el símbolo de una especie de mundo. Si ustedes vienen y ustedes clican sobre esta opción, si mantienen pulsada esta opción, van a ser capaces de ver las 3 opciones que existen para la interpretación en esta ocasión: inglés, japonés y español. Por favor, hagan clic en la opción de su preferencia y es mejor que como paso siguiente puedan silenciar el audio original de la conferencia. De esta forma solo van a poder escuchar al intérprete simultáneo de el webinar. I think I finished, so I'll get over to Nadia so we can start. Thank you very much, everyone. Bienvenidos a todos.
Nadia, you are muted.
Oh, I talked to myself for a very long time. Thank you, Osama, Nicholas, again. I hope all of you who need to be connected in other languages are able to do so now. If you have any questions,
ضبط على اللغة التي يريدها. إذا ما كانت لديكم أي أسئلة تستطيعون وضعها في حالة المحادثة.
Los miembros panelistas, espero que compartimos con sus experiencias, porque han servido con nosotros muchas veces en el pasado, porque son experiencias de diferentes partes del mundo. Antonio tiene muy buena experiencia y Antonio nos une de Canberra y trabajó con el proceso electoral, gobernanza local, participación ciudadana y la participación política. Tiene una amplia experiencia en el campo de gestión de apoyo. Sí. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I'm overwhelmed by seeing.
Primero, realmente me alegro mucho de ver tantos colegas que han participado en esa importante sesión de webinar. Debería de darle las gracias y la apreciación especial a PNUD, que preparó para esa discusión. Primero vamos a hablar al
participation when managing elections under COVID-19, to then illustrate more specific issues that were encountered in the election of the Republic of Korea, or more informally, South Korea, how we call it. So the exceptional circumstances surrounding an election at the time of a global pandemic, as Nadja said, they pose unprecedented challenges. So unless absentee voting provisions are fully in place, the requirement to cast a ballot in person at a polling station in confined and crowded places and handling voting materials that are touched by others presents health risks for voters and for poll workers alike, and also the potential of spreading the contagion exponentially. So for an electoral management body, or EMB, a key challenge resides in its own ability to reconcile the operational complexities that are involved in delivering participatory elections under a pandemic with safety requirements that must be adopted to protect the health of all those participating. So unless effective and convincing safeguards are put in place, health implications and the fear of contagion may keep voters away from the polling stations, no matter how well, how professionally the electoral process may have been prepared. And so what is the purpose of a well-prepared electoral process if its end users do not participate? So very low rates in participation undermine the credibility of election and also the representativity of the elected bodies in normal circumstances and in exceptional ones alike. And what if, for example, South Koreans, despite all the safeguards and preparations, had instead remain unconvinced that in-person voting was safe? Would very low turnout rates affect the legitimacy of a National Assembly that is elected only by a minor portion of the electorate? So ideally, an EMB should never put in the predicament, should be never put in the predicament of having to choose what comes first between the health of its citizens and the health of democracy. Similarly, without effective health safeguards in place, voters should never be put before having to choose whether to exercise their voting rights and risk their life, or instead staying away to protect their life and be disenfranchised. So as we will hear shortly, voters in the US primaries in Wisconsin faced this very dilemma. And I found very powerful and inspiring some of their statements, which also exemplify my reasoning. So after casting a ballot, a voter stated, I had to come here today and risk my life to vote, and I'm happy to do it because that is my right, but I cannot believe that I had to do this. And another one said, poll workers put their lives on the line for us to vote, so why shouldn't we? This, in a way, the dilemma is not between these two extreme choices, but on exactly how they can be reconciled. The issue is how voting can be made safe. So in considering health risks and implications, the EMB should determine the feasibility of implementing that election under the severe operational restriction of the pandemic, while upholding principles of inclusion, transparency, integrity, and without compromising the safety of its voters. So confronted with this very dilemma, almost 60 countries have deferred their elections. Instead, South Korea, with its decision to go ahead, was one of those of the first, after Mali, I think, having to manage the national elections under the pandemic. So they only had 45 days to deliver exceptional elections and ensure a legitimate voter turnout. So the NEC, the National Election Commission, not only had to try to minimize the risks for health risks for voters, but also to reassure and convince them of its capacity to ensure safe voting conditions. And so first, the NEC encouraged early voting and to reduce the number of voters that were expected to gather at the polling station on election day. And so this special voting provision during the two-day early voting period allows any voter to vote in advance anywhere in the country, irrespective of their residence and their current whereabouts. So voters can also vote on the go in railway stations or when before boarding on a plane. So the NEC also extended voting by mail, early voting by mail, to patients in hospital, in quarantine, or in self-isolations. And this mail voting method was only previously used with special categories of voters with limited mobility, like elderly and prisoners. For voters who were infected after the closure of the mail voting period, they could cast an early vote along with medical staff at special polling stations established in hospitals. So especially introduced provisions that called late voting were allowed for quarantine voters, so they could leave their places of confinement and vote on election day at ordinary polling stations, but only after official voting hours. And to ensure a safe in-voting on election day at the polling station, the NEC introduced a code of conduct that outlined very stringent safeguards that to be followed by voters through every voting step. They had to wear face masks, have the temperature checked before entering the station, keep safety distance, sanitize their hands, wear gloves, etc. Poll workers had also to follow strict hygiene rules. They sanitized and ventilated the polling stations, they disinfected voting booths, stamps, and other materials. And similar precautions were also adopted for the safety of security personnel, media, candidate representatives, and domestic observers. There were no international observers. The NEC communication strategy also to reach the electorate, disseminate information, messages, advertisements, and the code of conduct through different means, its own ETV and national TV channels, printed media, posters, and banners. But inevitably, the stringent safeguards impacted on transparency and accessibility of voting and counting processes. But then polling station activities were live streamed at regular intervals, both during early voting and election day. So in addition to measure to facilitate participation, the NEC was also forced to restrict some phases of the electoral process. Out-of-country voting, or OCV, was conducted only through in-person voting at the diplomatic missions abroad. So voting in those foreign countries were experiencing major COVID-19 outbreaks could expose voters to infection. And also the lockdowns and the restrictions on movements that were imposed by host governments couldn't allow voters to leave their homes, so they couldn't vote. And this meant to close 55 facilities and disenfranchised about 51% of overseas voters and recorded the lowest OCV turnout ever recorded of nearly 24%. So another problem was that even if during the election South Korea wasn't in a national lockdown, the restriction of movement and the social distancing affected conventional election campaigning methods. This precluded rallies, debated, public speeches, door-to-door activities that couldn't take place. The campaigning had to then had a reduced tone, a reduced scale, reach, and impact in any previous election. And candidates were forced to resort to alternative methods to reach out to their voters. So the main accomplishments of South Korea elections were their seamless and safe management and the resulting high levels of voter participation. More than 29 million voters, so 60% of the 44 million electorate participated, and also marking the highest early voting, the highest turnout in 3 decades, and confirming the efficacy of the measures that were adopted to encourage and convince the electorate to vote. Of these, 12 million voted in advance, almost 27%, also the highest early voting turnout on record, and indicating that voters trusted early voting offered safer voting conditions. So the remarkable outcome of safe and participatory elections where they were managed under extremely adverse operating conditions attests the success of the NEC and basically resulted from several factors. Like the efficacy of the absentee and advanced voting arrangements, the seamless integration of the health safeguards with the election procedures, the trust that voters place in the MB and the public health measures, and the extraordinary communication measures, efforts that were to promote and clarify the adopted measures and safeguards to clarify them to the electorate. And also the meticulous compliance by voters with measures and safeguards on election day, the wide availability of manpower, and that also medical supplies. So in conclusion, South Korea's experience shows that administering an election under a global pandemic is not an ordinary task for any EMB. So in context that have unresponsive electoral frameworks, weak infrastructures, undeveloped ICT environments, low capacities, insufficient resources, and polarized political environment, and low trust, operating under the extreme conditions, a restriction of a pandemic could make the achievement of highly participatory elections a difficult or even an impossible task. We are now gradually coming to realize that COVID-19 is changing the way in which we think and do elections. So we need to realize that also electoral management must urgently evolve to meet this new reality that all democracy, with no distinction, are confronting. So the only feasible alternative that I see, at least, is that of ramping up electoral framework systems, processes, and capacities, I would say, so that they could be could more effectively respond to the pressing challenge that the pandemic is posing in reconciling the integrity of electoral outcomes with the safety of voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. We followed South Korea, and I mean, to the election community and to us in the UN, it was really amazing to see the commission pulled out in such a short time since the announcement of the pandemic, an election in which people felt safe to go to the polls. So there's a lot to be learned there. But as you said, so much of it has to do with the public's compliance with any measures that a commission or a government puts in place. And we will hear also now from Megan Wolf how elections went in Wisconsin. Megan has extensive experience in the field of elections. She serves as Wisconsin's chief election officer. She manages the staff which administers and enforces Wisconsin's laws related to elections and voting. She served and she currently serves on several boards at the national level on elections. We all followed the developments in her state, and I'm personally very excited to hear the experience from her perspective and how the Commission was able to respond to the pandemic in the midst of already planned election preparations. They were in the middle of elections. They had planned and prepared. And she will tell us how they actually, in the end, ensured what I think was good turnout relative to the context. Megan, thanks for joining us from Wisconsin, where it's 8 a.m. time. We really appreciate it. You have 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. And thank you all so much for being here this morning and for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I truly am honored to have this opportunity and in awe by all of the esteemed participants from around the world that are part of this conversation. So thanks for all that you do in the field of elections around the world to ensure free and fair elections. So thank you. As Naja mentioned, I'm Megan Wolf. I'm the Chief Election Official for the state of Wisconsin. One thing that you should know about elections in the United States is that every state, all 50 states and the territories, run elections very differently. We all have our own state laws that outline how elections have to be conducted in each of our states. The state of Wisconsin is no exception in being incredibly unique in how we run elections, even from other states. So on April 7th, we conducted a statewide election. It wasn't a national election. It was our state's presidential preference primary. It was also our state Supreme Court race, and then many, many local races, nonpartisan races, things like city council or mayor or other local elections that were on the ballot in each of our communities. The state of Wisconsin, another thing that makes us very unique is we operate elections at the municipal level. So that means each of our cities and townships has its own local election official, and we have 1,850 of them, local election officials. Most other states operate at the county level, which means that they may have 50 to maybe 100 local election officials. So we're very decentralized in how we run elections in the state of Wisconsin. We're also unique in that I serve as the nonpartisan, so I can't be affiliated with any political organization, chief election official for my state, whereas in most other states, there's an elected Secretary of State that serves in my role in my capacity. So it's very different sort of how we run elections. As the chief election official for my state, I oversee the State Elections Commission, and we are, again, our staff is required to be nonpartisan, and our role is to administer the law, administer elections, court decisions as they relate to elections. We have no authority or ability to change the law. We have no ability or authority to change the dates of the election, to change any of the deadlines associated with the election, or to change any of the procedures that are outlined in the law as well. All of those things would require some kind of act by our elected officials or an intervention by the courts. We're not able to make any of those changes. Our role is simply to whatever sort of hand is dealt to us, it is our job to find a way to administer the law and implement the law as it's handed to us. Getting to the April 7th presidential preference election in Wisconsin. So again, during that process, we only had about 20 days since the stay-at-home order, the public health crisis came about until our election. So the April 7th election began at the end of February. And so our first stay-at-home order from our governor came about on March 12th, which was 3 weeks after more than 3 weeks after ballots had already gone out for the April election. So a lot changed after an active election was already underway. And again, from the time that order was issued and things were sort of solidified in terms of how our state was responding to the health crisis, we had about 20 days to completely shift our approach. At the end, and I'll get into the details sort of how, but at the end of the day, our presidential preference election on April 7th was the second highest historical turnout in our state's history for that election. So exceeded turnout from 2008, from 2012. It was second only to the last presidential preference in 2016, which was a very hotly contested presidential preference contest where there was a great deal of interest. And so in 2012, for example, turnout in Wisconsin for that election was about 1.1 million voters. Turnout in 2016 was just over 2 million. For the 2020 comparable election, turnout was just over 1.5 million. So right between sort of those two measures that we had. One of the significant differences for this election was the shift to voting by mail. So state of Wisconsin law has always provided the ability for any elector to choose to vote by mail without any sort of excuse. However, historically, only about 6% to the high point of maybe 10% of Wisconsin voters vote by mail. We're very much a in-person voting state. We, across our nation, have one of the highest turnouts in the country in the state of Wisconsin, and the majority of that is done in person on election day. We have same-day election day registration and other things that most voters opt to utilize. In this election, in that 20-day window of this public health crisis intersecting with the election, over 80% of Wisconsinites opted to vote by mail. So you can imagine this was a very extreme and significant shift in voter behavior from about 6% historically voting by mail to more than 80% choosing to cast their ballot by mail, which in the end amounted to about 1.2 million absentee ballots that were voted by mail in the state of Wisconsin, compared to other records of maybe 400,000 at an absolute high point in previous elections. So that caused a lot of changes that had to be made in the middle of an election. So as you all probably know, elections right now really heavily rely on technology and making sure that our systems, our databases, our voter lookup tools are all able to accommodate the voter behavior. We had to change all of our systems to accommodate voter behavior to vote by mail, giving them the option to request their absentee ballot, to do things like take a picture of their photo ID to upload it for their local election official. All of these things required us to literally work around the clock for about 3 weeks, sitting next to servers, making sure that we were increasing capacity as it was needed. And so the technological aspect of this was enormous, and we were able to keep pace with all of the changes in technology and the capacity needed. In terms of election day and in-person voting, so our state law does require that we have to still have in-person voting opportunities available to all electors. And so while electors were able through the Friday before the election to opt to get a vote by mail ballot, the law does provide that we must provide opportunities in all 1,850 localities for voters to appear in person. And so as soon as the public health crisis became front and center, we began to work on preparing those local election sites. So in a usual large turnout election, we'd have about 30,000 poll workers statewide that would staff a polling site. What we were finding during this public health crisis is, of course, many of our poll workers who may have been of an older demographic were not able to serve as poll workers safely. And so we surveyed our local election officials and found a shortage of more than 7,000 poll workers statewide. Some of our jurisdictions reporting that they weren't even able to open one polling place with the needed election inspectors. And so we began major recruitment efforts around the state to recruit poll workers, to try to recruit other public servants and government employees to serve in that capacity, maybe younger people, college students who perhaps their classes had been postponed, and to encourage people to serve as poll workers. Some of those efforts were fruitful, but of course there was a great deal of fear. People weren't sure that they were going to be able to serve safely ultimately we weren't, through those recruitment efforts, able to find enough poll workers. At the end, our governor did initiate our National Guard. So the National Guard are members of the military. However, they have other full-time jobs and they serve in a reserve capacity in case the state has a disaster, usually a natural disaster or other things. The National Guard did step in to serve as poll workers, but they did so in plain clothes as members of their community. So they served in, again, plain clothes as members of their community, not as military members, not in uniform, as basically volunteers in those communities. And this allowed us to fill that gap that we had in terms of poll workers. And frankly, I'm not sure we would have been able to find enough poll workers to run all those required in-person sites had they been not able to serve in that capacity. And our poll workers cited it as a real benefit and support to them to be able to have them. And we also hope that those National Guard members will continue to serve as poll workers just in their own citizen capacity in the future, helping to make our pool of poll workers more robust for the fall elections and our nationwide presidential election in November of this year. Another challenge that we had to overcome was finding supplies for our polling places. So we had a nationwide shortage, as I'm sure we had a worldwide shortage, in sanitation supplies, in personal protective equipment. And we got to work right away trying to find sanitizer and cleaning solutions, even things like paper toweling to wipe down surfaces were all at an extreme shortage. And so at the state level, we had to source these things from around the country to try to find enough to be able to get to our polling places so that they could operate safely. At the end of the day, we were not able to find sort of your traditional hand sanitizer or cleaner. We actually worked with private industry, a distillery eventually, to work on manufacturing our own sanitation solution to buy through the state that we were able to send out and distribute to all of our local polling places so that they could incorporate that as part of their practices. We also did things like source pens so that each voter was able to have their own pen that they could use to sign the poll book and to mark their ballots. And so we sent out, over 1.5 million pens around the state for those things. We also worked with a public health official in our state emergency management center to create public health guidance for the polling places. So we developed a checklist that incorporated the public health guidance that we received from the state with election practices and asked the poll workers to use that on election day. We also created a number of signs, things like a screener for the door about who and who should not enter based on health concerns, and then offering alternatives such as a curbside ballot, where a voter is able to drive up in their car and receive a ballot curbside. They can do things like show their photo ID through the glass of their window rather than interact hand-to-hand or face-to-face with the poll worker. So we created signage and procedures for many of those things, as well as a great deal of training for not only those National Guard members, but any new poll workers so that they could incorporate those public health practices, things like making sure that everyone sanitized their hands before starting the process and then sanitize their hands after. We gave them isopropyl alcohol wipes for all the voting equipment so that it could be sanitized between each use. And again, those alcohol-based sanitizers to be able to wipe down polling booths and other surfaces as they were touched between each voter. So ultimately, very few people did vote on election day. There were only about 300,000 that showed up statewide to vote on election day, into comparison to a usual election where we'd have over 1 million. And what, some of the news stories that may be seen around the country came from one jurisdiction that had long lines. All the others in the other 1,850 locations did not experience those line issues. In some of our larger jurisdictions, again, because of the lack of poll workers, they had to consolidate their in-person polling sites because of the limited amount of poll workers that they had available to them, causing some of those issues. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the public health officials have taken a look at voter participation and have not seen any increase in people being exposed or coming ill because of their participation in the election on April 7th. That being said, we have learned a great deal about what we need to do to prepare as we head into the fall elections in terms of sourcing those supplies, making sure we did have masks and gloves available to all the poll workers that we were able to send them, but making sure that we have an ample supply so that our poll workers are able to staff all of the necessary in-person sites safely as we head into the fall election cycle. Again, thank you all for this opportunity, and I look forward to, at the end of this, to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's incredible what you guys were able to turn around in just a matter of weeks. It really shows that where there's a will, there's a way. And you were able to mobilize so many parts of the state and of society to make it happen. And I appreciate the really practical examples you provided to our audience of what, I mean, down to the type of pens and the different disinfectants, like the little things that you wouldn't think about are very important now, especially in this crisis. One of the questions that I see coming up again and again is, and I will give it to speakers later, but is the issue of out-of-country voting. This, of course, is a particular challenge for the Arab region, as Rafael has noted in the chat box, but it's as well an issue for many other countries. So when we come back to you, it would be good if you can touch a bit on, how to address OCV and especially since countries that do have provisions for it require in-person voting. So it would be good if you could touch upon that later. But now, before further ado, I will ask our last speaker, President Nabil Bafoun. He's president of the Tunisia Election Commission. He has been running the commission for several years. He joined it as a commissioner in 2011. He has overseen many of the portfolios in the commission. He oversaw the most recent elections that were really historic for the country as it continued on its path to consolidating democracy there. Thank you, Nabil. He joins us from Tunis, where it's 2 p.m. now. Mr. President, you have 10 minutes. Please share with us the decision and how you got to that decision on postponing local elections in Tunisia that were planned during the pandemic. Thank you. Osama, can you unmute President Nabil Bafoun? We can't hear you, wait. Sorry, before I will tell our English-speaking audience, before you begin.
شكرا لك سيدة ناجية.
Wait, President, wait. I will just tell because President Nabil is speaking Arabic, so I would like you to, for the English speakers, to go down to where you have a feature on the bottom of your screen for interpretation and click English, and you should be able to the English translation of his presentation. If anybody has a problem, please let us know in the chat box. Thank you, Mr. President. Go ahead.
شكرا لكم، شكرا ناجية، وشكرا لليو ان دي بي لإتاحة هذه الفرصة، وأنا سعيد بالحضور معكم ورؤية عدة وجوه لم أرها منذ مدة. وفي نفس الوقت أود أن أقدم التعازي لأهل وشعب وأقارب الدكتور أحمد جازة رئيس اللجنة الوطنية المستقلة للانتخابات بجزر القمور، فرحمة الله عليه. بالفعل نحن في تونس كان من المتوقع إجراء انتخابات بلدية يوم 28 مارس و29 مارس، إلا أن رزنامة الانتخابات تم تعليقها من طرف الهيئة العليا المستقلة للانتخابات بقرار حيث اتخذنا يوم 14 مارس
with a decision taken in the 14th of March to postpone this calendar and just to keep the list of the candidates as is. This decision was a preceding decision imposed on us by the reality that we have, the realistic circumstances that we have had in the period that preceded 14th of March. The virus, coronavirus, starting to outbreak, and we thought that it is a real risk, it is a danger. This is on one hand, and on the second hand, we thought that we predicted that the turnout is going to be very low due to coronavirus. So this led us to this decision of the electoral calendar, and the electoral calendar made us take this decision because it was supposed to start in 15th of March. And you know that the electoral campaigning have a lot of meetings, public meetings, direct and indirect interaction, field interaction. All of this were factors of risk. So that was a presidential decision, because the Commission of Election in Tunisia didn't have any legal basics to take such a decision. So the electoral law never predicted such circumstances, so we can delay the elections. We have article number 105 of the electoral law that talks about the delay of one station or two to be conducted again, like in 1 month or two. But we delayed the elections in 2 districts. So this decision, with the general authority that the Commission have or has, we needed to make a balance between the safety and the health of the citizen and the electoral dignity. So it was a good decision to delay the elections. Maybe we took this decision in advance because the government took a similar decision. The president made a governmental decision that ban the movement of the public. Also, it talked about the risk and the danger. Or there's an article in the law that talks about any danger or any risk that could be sudden, and accordingly the government or our authority can take a decision. So we took the decision and we kept the list of the candidates. And the question now, what is the plan for the Commission to achieve the elections in the future, knowing that COVID-19 seems to last for a longer time with us. And it's almost definite that we are going to have elections within the pandemic of COVID-19. So we need to take some procedures like gloves, masks, not to use the indelible ink. So what we are going to do in the case of people that are confined and they cannot go outside their places, like for 14 days. So all these procedures, we cannot be decisive about them only by us. Why? Because there are some conditions or some incomes from a health perspective. So we need to communicate with the Ministry of Health to find a manual for procedures that defines what are the conditions, the provisions to achieve elections, to conduct elections with such pandemic, and also how to manage, how to organize the lineup in front of the electoral stations, the indelible ink, and taking all precautions and procedures with the Ministry of Health. And there was a meeting between the Commission on the 22 of April to have a training about this issue, to have elections in Tunisia with the existence of COVID-19, and to conduct a successful elections, and also taking into consideration having a good budget, a complementary budget to take all these precautionary procedures and to achieve the electoral process. This means, in a brief, that the Commission took the decision of delaying the electoral calendar in 2 districts. But it seems for me that it could be much more broader than just to think about it locally. You know that there are a lot of elections that are taking place outside the country, like for people in diaspora, voting for the presidential elections, and the health procedures are related in such case to those countries, and those procedures could not be the same taken inside Tunisia. So we need to find broader measures to have a unified procedures and to coordinate with the other countries to manage the voting of our citizens. The other thing, we are about to have a partial elections in such circumstances of COVID-19, and we will establish a health manual or health procedures manual, how to protect the safety of the voter, also protecting the healthy process of elections. I'm happy to be with you, and I'll communicate with you through the questions.
Thank you so much, President. It was not easy decision, I'm sure, on your part, and many considerations that were taken in South Korea and Wisconsin weighed on your mind as you were making that decision. So we really appreciate that you share that insight with us. As we know, many commissions in the region are expecting elections this year, and many of them will be looking to you and to the other panelists for ideas how to ensure that they can have elections that are safe and that we can ensure a turnout while also protecting the integrity of the process. We are now in the Q&A session, so I appreciate those of you who've already sent in your questions. I will field them to our speakers. The first questions that were coming were on OCV, so I would like Antonio, if you will, maybe speak a little bit about that globally, and if you have some recommendations on how countries that have provisions for OCV can ensure that they can take place safely in this environment.
Thanks, Naja. I will use the experience of South Korea because I think it's very telling, in the sense that the main limitation for South Korea is that it only had in-person voting at diplomatic missions, and so the conditions in some countries for them to for voters to risk the contagion in these countries that were experiencing severe outbreaks were really the risks were really high, and also in the restrictions that wouldn't allow them to go out and to leave their home and vote. So had there been absentee voting modalities arrangements there, things would have been different. So in a way, also the difficulty was that the votes had to be sent to South Korea to be counted, and this also under the lockdowns and restrictions was very difficult to be made. And so the NEC had to authorize 18 diplomatic missions to count the votes locally. So it's in my view the OCV difficulties of OCV depend very much from the individual single context that each country has, and also on the modality, on the voting modalities that are implemented. A lesson that came out from the OCV reason of the OCV operation of South Korea is that the extreme conditions in which EMBs have to operate in OCV and in country election may require sacrifices and compromises that normally wouldn't be there in elections held in normal circumstances and normal situations. And this may pose challenges that in these normal situations simply wouldn't be there. And so, and inevitably, in my opinion, there would be prices to pay and operations to sacrifice operating in these extreme conditions. And OCV, you know, in South Korea was one together with the election campaign.
Thank you, Antonio. And if there are follow-up questions on this, please enter them in the chat box. And Antonio, you're also free to respond there if you like. The next question really is on cost. Maybe I will give this to Megan to talk about what additional costs and budgetary implications there were for the additional and the new provisions that you had to put in place.
Of PPE and of sanitizer, and so it was quite expensive for us to source those things, and then of course to distribute them, to deliver them. Even within our state of Wisconsin, you know, it's a far distance from the top of the state to the bottom where our capital is, and so some materials had to be sent by, you know, state plane or other ways to get it up to the northern part of the state when it was needed. And so all of those finding the materials and distributing them were quite expensive, in addition to, of course, the postage. So all of our local jurisdictions had only planned to send that 6 to 10% of the ballots by mail. And then when you're shifting, that represents an unbudgeted cost for postage. And so as we look ahead to the remainder of the year, we anticipate there's probably over $5 million just in postage that's not currently accounted for in those local budgets. And so trying to find a way to shift those because they still need to plan to have election day polling places and the costs that go along with that as well. We also found a lot of delays in the supply chain for paper. So things like envelopes for the vote by mail ballots, actually printing the ballots on paper, there were delays in the supply chain for paper, and it was really difficult for us to find enough envelopes to be able to send all the by mail absentee ballots as well. And so planning ahead for all of those things, and again, anticipating that there can be a premium associated with those for those additional costs as well. One of the things I will say though, that I think could be of great benefit to jurisdictions that have budgetary, you know, concerns is our local election officials operate on very, very tiny budgets, and they were incredibly resourceful in finding ways to make their polling places safe without having to spend a great deal of money. One of the examples I'll give you is things like a physical barrier at the table where voters sign the poll book. Many of them found things like old windows and propped them up on tables to create a barrier where they could still see the voter, but where they weren't able, they kind of had a cough guard or a shield from that interaction. And so many of them were incredibly resourceful with working in their local communities to find solutions to be able to help them be safe without having to spend a great deal of money, because finding those things again in the midst of this global shortage of many of the supplies does increase the costs.
Thank you so much. The same question for Antonio, but I will ask you, Antonio, if you can write the answer in the chat box. just to save some time, but I will go now to Nabil Bafoun. There was a question from colleagues in Nepal on how you liaised with political parties and how did you manage that aspect of the decision around postponing elections?
أريد الاستماع إلى سؤال، لم أستمع إلى سؤال.
So the question was how did you have the dialogue with political parties? How did you engage with them and the political stakeholders in the decision to postpone the election?
هو في الحقيقة الأحزاب السياسية يعني تلقت بإيجابية هذا التعليق، لأنه الأحزاب السياسية نفسها كانت متخوفة من
themselves were very concerned of the spread of coronavirus, and they were expecting low turnout in the elections, so their efforts would be in vain, would go in vain, and the electoral process would not have a good results. So the political parties expected such a decision from the Commission, but the difficulty that the Commission faced is the legal foundation on which we base our decision. So that's why we said it was unprecedented decision taken by the Commission, which used their authority to prevent any harm that could be caused over the voters due to the spread of coronavirus. And we didn't find any objection. We didn't find any opposition, not from the political parties, nor from any civil society or the government.
Thank you. I will ask Antonio to reflect a bit on the question on why there was such high turnout in both cases of South Korea and Wisconsin, when intuitively we would think that people would not come out to vote. You can share some insights from a global perspective.
Sorry, I was finishing replying online, on the chat, but I will put it later.
Sorry,
I think
multitask.
I'm multitasking, but I'm convinced that it's not for a single factor, but it's a multitude of factors. And I would say that maybe I could summarize them in some of the takeaways that I will mention later. But I would say the unprecedented, in a global pandemic, in an election run under a global pandemic, everyone would expect that levels of voter turnout would be minimal. And so what happened in South Korea is the result of a combination of several factors, which I will list later. But strong civic sense, resources, conducive political environment, coordination, communication, etc. All this combined, and if only one is missing, I think you could have problems in achieving even not the same, but even similar results. So I'm posting now.
Thanks, Antonio. Megan, I'm going to pass it to you. We have a few questions on what transpired in Wisconsin. One is on, were there any new cases? Did the process lead to spreading of the virus further? A question on sort of the military being involved or the civilian elements of the military being involved in the process. What can you reflect on that? What does that say about the security and safety of the public? Another question is, how do you ensure the identification of voters through mail-in ballots? How do you ensure there are no duplications or double voting? These three questions to you. Thanks, Mike.
One national publication just put one out yesterday too, doing that analysis, and it appears that there were less than 40 people that had participated in the election that have tested positive, and there's no correlation with them directly voting. It's sort of a causation doesn't equal that's actually what the cause was, and so we're still working through that data. The clerks actually have in our localities until today to record participation, and then we'll be able to do further analytics on who actually voted versus some of the positive test cases to see if there's any further correlation. But it appears that there was zero spike and that the curve, as they say in our state, has flattened during that time period where people would have been symptomatic. So there's no reason to believe that there was any increase. And again, I think those are due to the efforts of both voters and poll workers in taking those necessary measures as they did venture out. In terms of the military involvement, I think that when people heard about our citizens and around the world about the National Guard being involved, there was this sort of vision of this militant sort of presence, and that wasn't how it played out. Again, these were people that are citizen members of their military that served in their own personal citizen capacity as volunteers in plain clothes. They had no decision-making authority at the polling places. So it wasn't as if the military had any ability to determine who was able to vote or to tally or count the ballots. They were mostly serving in the roles of keeping social distancing, working with voters to understand how to interact with the polling places. They weren't tabulating votes. They weren't doing some of those decision-making processes, which I think was really important to voter confidence, that it wasn't as if the military took over being able to make decisions at the polling places. These were citizens in their own communities volunteering in that capacity to help. And we do anticipate, as we head into our remaining elections, our national election, that this will continue to be an option for us. We actually have another election on May 12th. So coming up here in a couple of days. And again, the National Guard will serve to help fill that gap in poll workers in that election as well. And so again, we'll continue to recruit citizens, but we think that this was a good option. I think having those safeguards though in place to ensure that the military doesn't have sort of decision-making capacity at the polling places is very, very important. In terms of how do we know who's casting a ballot when they're voting by mail? So we do have a photo ID law here in the state of Wisconsin. So when a voter requests their absentee ballot be sent to them by mail, they have to provide a picture or a copy of their photo ID with that request. That's then kept on file. And they have to be able to give us enough information about themselves to be able to request the ballot and for us to verify it against their record. We also have a very robust statewide voter registration database where all of the participation, the absentee ballot requests are recorded by the local election officials as they send out the ballots. And this allows us in real time every day to do a comparison and to make sure that people are not receiving multiple ballots. We're able to audit the system after the fact to see if anybody did cast a ballot more than once, and then they're prosecuted to the full extent of the law. When we do those audits, we do not find that there are very, very, very few cases of people that commit those types of crimes in terms of submitting multiple ballots as well. And so, I think having a way to compare those records on a regular basis is really important part of that process.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really informative to learn about the process in the States and how it varies across the country. Okay, I was on mute. Thank you, Megan. We have still 10 more minutes. We have a number of questions. I'll throw this out to Antonio. It's on mandatory voting. Question, how to consolidate mandatory voting against, people's right to not have their lives risked at the polling center. Any reflections on that?
Yes, I can quote the recent experience of Queensland's elections here in Australia, where as you know, Australia has mandatory voting, and for these exceptional circumstances, even if Australia is not currently facing any serious levels of outbreaks. There are still cases, and there are still restriction of movements and social distancing. So the electoral authorities excused voters. They lifted the compulsory voting for voters. And so if voters had reasons to fear for the safety at an election day at the polling stations, they had a certificate form to complete and send in, and they could be excused. And also they have the ability of using advanced absentee voting methods, and that helped as well.
Thanks so much. There's a question on election observation. Megan, I'll throw it out to you, but then also ask Antonio to reflect on it. What do you see as the future of election observation during the pandemic time? Did you have observers in Wisconsin? Antonio, what was the experience in South Korea?
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question, and one that we certainly need to dedicate some more attention to as we head into our presidential election in November. So there were very few observers at the April Wisconsin election. So our state law says that anyone that wants to observe the election, be them from around the state, around the country, around the world, are able to observe the elections, and it dedicates sort of an area and what they're able to observe at each of the polling places. And so while each of our political parties still did send out observers, we had to sort of manage that in-person process to make sure that only enough people were allowed in the polling place to still safely accomplish social distancing. And so many of the polling places had to set a limit on how many people could be in the building at any given time, and that included observers. But we required that they at least allow one observer from each political party to be allowed in as sort of that maximum capacity number, and that they had to maintain social distancing as part of that. Now, getting to international observers, I think observers are always a very important part of the process to ensure the integrity of our elections. And so we've also thought about other ways to be able to allow people to observe remotely. We've had things like a recall. In the state of Wisconsin in 2012, there was a recall of our governor, and during that entire process, we actually broadcast live on the internet. We streamed the recall process every day so that anyone was able to observe that electronically without having to appear in person. And so I think things like Zoom meetings and other electronic means will become very important to the election observer process. So again, that we're able to all have that transparency into elections without having to risk, some of the health consequences or the bans on travel. There's not travel really allowed within our country, even within our state, that's non-essential. And so I think coming up with electronic means for observers to be a part of the process will be a very important part of the conversation as we head into November.
Thank you so much, Antonio.
Yeah, thank you. And given that lack of any of the conditions that are required to ensure credible elections and extreme conditions of an election run under pandemic may affect in addition to participation, for instance, other fundamental standards, principles, like fairness, transparency, accessibility, inclusion, and so on and forth. You know, in observation will necessarily face very huge challenges, and you know, I reflected on this, and probably have more questions than answers. But you know, for instance, you know, this will have the pandemic will also have an impact on international recognized standards and principles. You know, for instance, in you know, considering the exceptionality of running an election in the current global situation, you know, and considering then that some electoral management principles and standards will have to be sacrificed, would there be any mitigating factors for observers to be considered when they will be assessing the vote and determine, you know, how free and fair it has been, and also what would be the acceptable level of sacrifice or compromise, you know, on the premises that these standards can never be questioned, you know, but there would be acceptable levels of sacrifice and of these principles for that election to be fairly evaluated against, you know, the inevitability and the exceptionality of the circumstances in which it had to be held. I was yesterday in another webinar with OEC, and they are considering to deploy in the next months, depending on circumstances, international observation missions. In South Korea, were not possible. There were domestic, where there was limited domestic observers inside the polling stations with the necessary requirements. But as I said, to minimize this the lack of accessibility and transparency due to the restrictions, the NEC decided to live stream the main activities, but it's not the same, but it's still something.
Thank you so much. I see President Nabil keeps answering his questions on the chat box. Thank you so much for that. We have a question, and I'll ask the President to reflect on it, on how we can support EMBs and legislatures with discussions for postponing elections where it becomes an issue of violating the Constitution, especially in fragile countries. So if you can speak a little bit about where the Constitution does not have provisions for delaying elections due to pandemics, how can support to parliaments, to EMBs help ensure that there is stability during a period of a crisis like this? You're on mute, President. You're on mute. I can't hear you. President, we can't.
The problem is in taking the decision of delaying the elections or postponing it for a reason that wasn't mentioned in the law or in the Constitution, because in the health situation like coronavirus, we don't find any reflections of this in the Constitution or in the law. The Tunisian constitution, just like any other constitution, talk about a specific danger, a sudden danger that suspends the regular operations of the government. In such a situation, the electoral commissions can depend on such article and customize it to delay the elections. But coronavirus, COVID-19 was very sudden. It was a surprise for all the institutions of Tunisia, including the Electoral Commission. So we had to avoid any harm, any danger that could impact any of the citizens. So as a part of the administration, we need to maintain the national order, and the health is a part of this order. So we needed to use our authority to delay the elections, just like what happened in Tunisia. But the question today, can we change the procedures or the measures of elections and to add new ones, like using sanitizers, using masks, using some temperature measures, and some quick tests to test COVID-19, also taking these decision about the indelible ink, to use it or not. All these procedures is from the within the authority of the Commission to manage the elections. So we can add such procedures at the days of elections, and also pertaining the electoral campaigning. But we still gonna have some difficulties that needs some legislative intervention. Like, for example, the franchise, the electoral franchise for those in quarantine, like for 14 days. Those we cannot wait for them, nor we can delay the time of the elections for them, because the Constitution says that elections need to be in 1 day. So we have some difficulties, like, for example, talking about electoral voting. Such issues, we can also have some legislative interventions with all stakeholders that have some opinions, some suggestions about such issues, that the electoral voting, is it effective or not, is it illegal or not. Such questions were all raised due to COVID-19, and it would also enhance and make us develop the electoral process, and we can adapt the electoral voting in some places, especially in some for our citizens that are abroad, in some countries that have difficult situations. So we are discussing about such a way of voting for people outside our country.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end. I will just ask each of the speakers to take 2 minutes in their closing to address questions that we haven't been able to ask, but maybe in your responses and your closing you can address them. One is on what, if any, special measures are taken to address the negative impacts of women's participation. As we know, it disadvantages already disadvantaged groups more, and women in particular fall into that category. The other question, were there any provisions in here in the case of Korea and Wisconsin for voting by persons with disabilities, blind voters? What, if any, arrangements were made? And then the other question on what and who provided guidelines, health guidelines, the WHO. I know in the US you have the CDC. So where did you turn to for that kind of guidance? Please take 2 minutes, then I'll come to you, Antonio, for the closing. Maybe Megan, you can start.
Great, thank you. So in terms of making sure that voters with disabilities had access to the polling places, that is one of the main reasons why in-person voting is still required in our law. So in-person absentee voting, so voting in person in the local election official's office before election day or at the polls on election day, those are procedures that are required to have accessible voting equipment and people that are able to assist voters if they have needs at the polls on election day. And so that is one of the main reasons why we're still required, even if most people vote by mail, to have in-person opportunities. Our does not require things like Braille ballots. And so it does require, though, that voting equipment have accessible features as well. But I do think that's something you're going to see some changes in the remainder of the year, is utilizing technology to be able to submit ballots perhaps to voters electronically, so that they can use their own assistive technology at home to be able to mark their ballots, and also have an opportunity to participate by mail if that's the safest option for them. So I do think that will be a change you'll see in elections across our country as we head into the fall. In terms of public health guidance, that's an excellent question, and something struggled with at the beginning. We're election experts in our office. We know all the election laws, we know all the election procedures inside and out, but we are not public health officials. And so we had to rely on public health officials, mainly the Center for Disease Control here in the United States that provides public health guidance. But what we also did is we requested that the federal and the state government provide our office with a public health liaison that could work with us for a few days to develop election-specific public health guidance. Because we found some of the large national publications about public health, they did not apply very well to elections. There are things like social distancing that people are aware of, but how do you incorporate that specifically into the elections process? So we actually had one day only with a public health official that worked with elections, and we worked with him for 24 hours straight to put together a whole wealth of public health guidance for elections. And so on our website, and that we publish to all of our local election officials, we created about 25 elections public health documents that go through each of the areas of elections, be it in person at the polls, how to interact with that ballot by mail when it comes back. Is there a waiting period? All of these things. Should poll workers quarantine themselves after the election? All of the various aspects of elections, we worked with our public health official to develop election-specific guidance. And so it certainly wasn't enough time. And as we head into the fall elections, we want to review all of our manuals and documentations through the lens of public health to be able to integrate the public health best practices into elections.
Thank you so much. It's really putting us in new uncharted territories. It would be great, Megan, if any of these are available online to our electoral authorities here and to election experts from around the world to have access to. If you could share a link, that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
Mr. President? Nabil? You're mute, Chairman, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Actually, we are expecting in Tunisia to have a guideline or a manual, health manual, on how to deal or how to have health procedures on election day with the COVID-19. This is on one hand. On the other hand, the participation of women in the electoral process. Actually, the circumstances of COVID-19 proved to the world the effective role of women. So it seems everywhere in the world that men are saluting women for the services they are delivering in health quarantine, and maybe her contribution to the electoral process, it's the same, just like the men. The important thing is to unify the procedures. Today, we are talking about Tunisian elections or USA elections, Mexican elections. Elections, if they are related with the health of citizens, it's an international, regional, and national problem. So thinking about the health procedures that we need to take, we need to unify them. We need to unify the procedures so we didn't find difficult situations that we cannot deal with, and we can benefit from the other procedures taken by other countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Now, before I ask Antonio to kind of do quick takeaways, because we're running out of time, there's an important topic that's come up in the conversation, which we won't have time to do in this webinar, but maybe it's a future topic, is on the media, the role of the media, especially as we move processes online, both in terms of campaigning, voting, interactions with the public, authorities. So this is something that we should consider and delve into, and we hope that your speaker that we have today, they can weigh in on that conversation in future webinars. So please do join us again. And Antonio, I'll give it to you now.
Thank you. So I think that the experience of South Korea has shown to the world that conducting a sound, safe, and participatory election under COVID is feasible. But however, this doesn't imply that the success of Korea can be easily adapted and applied to diverse context of other countries. So we should be reminded that not all countries may be equally prepared, equally equipped, and equally resolved in addressing these challenges. And so the success of South Korea shouldn't be taken as a face value, but should be given due consideration. And so as a first step, EMB, willing to take inspiration and guidance from this experience, should realistically evaluate their specific contexts against the existence of conditions that are essential to safely and fairly upholding the democratic rights of the citizens in a pandemic. So the first takeaway is that from South Korea is that there needs to be capacity to contain the pandemic by the time the elections are taking place. Unless it is conducted entirely by absentee voting, it would be inconceivable for voters to vote during a lockdown or with movements restricted or with a risk, with severe risk or contagion. And so unless voters trust the safe voting conditions that are put in place, if they don't trust them, they will not go to the polling stations. And this trust can be only earned through a proven and convincing capacity by the government, the EMB, the institutions, to control the outbreak during the institutions. The second takeaway is that a responsive electoral framework. All these safeguards and results could not be achieved at this voting absentee and early voting measures, and that if they were not in place already in the South Korea's framework. And so existing procedures were swiftly extended to voters in need, and this increased the turnout. And so unless these provisions are already in place, there are many unknown risks for EMBs. And the third takeaway is the problem of resources. You know, they not only be sufficient, but also swiftly made available. Otherwise, all the measures to ensure safe voter participation cannot be timely implemented. And in the case of Korea, they majorly helped managing the sound elections and achieving the high turnout. And so this could be a major impediment for countries that are unable to mobilize the same or similar level of resources. The important takeaway, the strong sense of civic duty. This played a major part in ensuring the turnout, high turnout in South Korea. And also the crisis created a sense of national unity for all voters, and regardless of their political affiliation, and turned voting in almost a nation-saving duty, and that was key. Fifth takeaway is the multilateral cooperation of the NEC, among the NEC and the various ministries, their departments, and specialized agencies as are the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And the last takeaway is the effective communication. So the wide dissemination of the code of conduct ensure that voters on election day they knew exactly what to do and what not to do. And this reduced the time they had to spend inside the police stations and minimize the risk of exposure to the virus.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you so much, speakers. I know we've gone over time, but I hope this was an informative, insightful session. As mentioned at the beginning, we bring these to you every 2 weeks. So we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. If you have ideas for specific themes, please send it to us. There was a question on whether there will be recommendations. We will try to get transcripts and produce some report to all of you and share it via social media. Follow us on Twitter. We hope to see you again next week. Thanks again, Megan, Nabil, Antonio, and to all of you who've joined us. Have a good evening.